the VTA, that was like a step backwards in my personal philosophy, right? Because we already were at more complex models, and we said we've got to downplay them. We've got to scale them back so that they can become more approachable. But then, when you make a model more simple, you lose things. This is it. For 20 years, I've been working on trying to get somewhere, and now I feel like we're doing it. We're finally doing it. He called me and said, I can't really tell you a whole lot about this, but I got this thing, and you got to see it, man. The clean black and white of the neurosurgery side. You either got it where it was supposed to go or you didn't. That's much more appealing from an engineering perspective. And the pandemic actually forced us to rethink. If you can't travel and you can't do in person, then you got to have a different method. And this forced us to develop that platform, for that, kind of new reality. And frankly, I think it's better now. I guess I kind of told Utah, well, no thanks for the job, but I will take Chris Butson. You know what I mean? So he was, effectively, he and Svetlana were,
Welcome to Stimulating Brains.
Hello and welcome back to Stimulating Brains, everyone. In this episode, I had the great honor to speak with Professor Cameron McIntyre from the Case Western University in Ohio. Cameron is without any doubt the world expert in DBS modeling and has been creating realistic and biophysically plausible DBS models since around 2002, so for around 20 years now. Cameron's lab also focuses on software prototype development and on industry collaborations to create commercial products to make these models impactful in the medical community and in hospitals. More recently, Cameron has created a realistic pathway atlas of the basal ganglia, so the region between subthalamic nucleus and GPI, which are the most common targets in DBS, and also has come up with a software to holographically plan DBS and SEEG surgeries. The system has already been used to plan surgeries, and during the pandemic, the team had to come up with creative solutions to do that offline. So there were several surgeons involved, each in their living room, each in a different city, and they were able to plan holographically in augmented reality together. So that will surely revolutionize the way we do DBS and other types of functional neurosurgery in the future. Cameron gives great advice about how to run a lab, how to found a research career, and he is a really interesting person in general with also a very particular hobby, as you will hear in a second. So it was a lot of fun to pick his brain, and I'm sure you're gonna like this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stimulating Brains, episode number 10. All right. So, dear Cameron, thank you so much for doing this. I will have formally introduced you by now, but to break the ice and so listeners can learn a bit about yourself, what do you do when you're not in the lab? Any hobbies, passions?
Yeah. So, my main hobby and passion, at least, over the last 6 years of my life, has been my son, Leo. So he is... at the stage now where it's fun. Those first couple years were not very much fun. No matter what people tell you, I don't know. That's not for me. But now it is a lot of fun, actually. And I understand now. I had kids late in life. It wasn't a motivation to me in the past. And now I understand why people do it. So anyway, so that takes up most of my time, outside of work. But then, probably my passion that I've spent the most time on over the last, 20 years of my life has been car racing. And it's great fun. I really love it. I started in, kind of street cars that you take on racetracks, and then, you evolve. It's kind of an addictive drug, and you start putting more and more resources into it, and you get faster and faster cars, and then you get factory built race cars, and then you get, it snowballs.
Sounds amazing. What type of cars are these, and like how fast do you go, or like is speed the only thing? Probably also the.
Yeah, so speed's not the only. So I do what they call road course racing or sports car racing. And so these are closed tracks, so not like circuit or not oval tracks like NASCAR. They're twisty and turny. They call them road courses. And then these are sports cars. So things like, kind of Porsches or Ferraris or whatever, or Mazda Miatas or Volkswagen GTIs or whatever,
okay.
Right? There's a whole spectrum.
But they are regulated in terms of how many PS they can have, or is that all open?
Yeah, well, so there's many, many different classes. And so, for every different type of car, there's kind of a different class of racing that you can, enter into. And then, you have everything from, kind of, I guess you'd call it like your weekend mechanic who has, a very small budget, but can deal with their car themselves and build the car themselves. And, to people that show up in helicopters, with giant semi rigs full of equipment and cars and people supporting them. Right. And all of these people converge, at the same time at these racetracks. And it's actually kind of interesting in that regard because it's such a diverse, group. But you all have a common passion, and sure. And you all have something, that you like, and you always have something to talk about with these people, even though like you wouldn't think a billionaire would be interested in talking to, whatever, a redneck mechanic kind of thing, right? So, but they do, and that's kind of cool.
Cool.
The other thing I like about it is that it is so, diametrically opposed to my academic life.
Of course, yeah.
So completely different people, completely different, sort of like approach to life. And, I look at academia, and to me, it's like amazingly risk averse and very, focused on, a goal. And, kind of my racing life is full of all these people that are, crazy risk takers. And, like they got all kinds of different things going on. And, just like you couldn't imagine two different groups of friends. And I really like that part of it as well. So I think that's, really fun. So.
Really, I have to ask two more follow-up questions. So about the risk, have you had accidents and like how many cars did you ride or do you ride? Is it more in parallel, or do you have one favorite at a time, or how does that work?
Yeah. So once again, many different race series. So, as time has gone on and you kind of, it's a skill and you practice and you get better. And then as you get better, you get more opportunities to race in different things. And so I do kind of what I would consider two levels of racing. So you got to imagine, racing has, like an unbelievable number of levels, right? So Formula One would be the very, very top. The most money, you're spending more than $100 million a year to race in Formula One, right? Mercedes is spending at least that amount. Okay, that's one thing. Then maybe the next level down is maybe IndyCar in the United States. They're spending, who knows, $25 million a year to run an IndyCar. Then there is what they would call prototype sports car racing, or, sort of like Le Mans, 24-hour Le Mans kind of cars. And that would be then, let's call that the third level of, kind of racing. Still, many, many millions of dollars. And then there's like NASCAR racing in the United States. So not as expensive because the cars aren't as expensive to run. But same thing, you got, just huge expenses. And then you get into more of what they would call grassroots racing. So more, driver financed racing. And no one is a pro. They might call themselves a pro, but they're not they're not real pros, you know?
Yeah.
And then within that, then there's all these stratifications of, high level, mid level, entry level kind of racing. And so, I spend half of my time maybe running with, my buddies in what I would call entry level racing or, club racing. So National Auto Sports Association or, things like that. So these are like weekend track warriors or weekend warriors, Yeah. And then, so let's say I do 8 to 10 race weekends a year. So 4 of those would be in NASA and 4 of them would be in then this series that I would consider sort of like, I don't know, mid-level, serious racing. And that's in this series called International GT. And that is, like fans actually pay tickets to come watch us race, like that kind of thing, like it's pretty cool. And I can't believe it. But, the cars are a lot cooler. So these are, 911, Porsche 911 Cup cars, Ferrari 458 Challenge cars. So they're factory built race cars that are really cool. Now I can't afford to run those cars. I actually run what's called a Volkswagen TCR car. So that's a factory built Volkswagen GTI race car, basically. And so, whatever, I do what I can to compete against those guys. I've got a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine. They've got, 6-cylinder, 400 horsepower, engines, 4 liters. So, big difference. But there's a lot of, kind of things that you can do to stay competitive. And I try my best. So
great. And the risk, the accidents, did you have?
I forgot about it. Yeah. So yes, I've totaled like 3 or 4 cars in my life. Some of which I own, some of which were someone else's that I was contract driving for, like it happens. It's part of it. But, I tell my wife this all the time. So my wife is an amazingly risk averse person. And I am, I consider, at least in academia, I'm a pretty big risk taker, Sure. So anyway, I tell her, like racing, like, everyone is out there with an appropriate level of training and a huge amount of safety equipment. And so from my perspective, it's safer than driving on the highway. Mm-hmm. Like if I get in a wreck in a race, like I feel like I'm way safer than if I get in a wreck, on the highway. So,
sure.
So I've never been injured. I've never been on fire. Never even, had that kind of like scary risk.
Okay.
Because usually when you wreck, you wreck, probably once each season, you're going to have a wreck. You have to plan for it. It's part of your budget.
Okay.
But yeah, everything happens in slow motion, and it's not scary when it's happening. Like, because you're going to hit the wall, and like those milliseconds take forever.
Mm-hmm. Wow, I would be scared, I'm sure, but probably get used to it at some point if it's really one time a season. So great. So let's dive into the science a bit. Maybe looking back, what were essential turning points in your career? Who were the mentors that truly stuck out? What do you think was important for you to learn and know early on?
Yeah, man. So, you had asked me this question before, and so I kind of spent some time thinking about it because I think it's, you kind of, you follow your daily path and you kind of know what you're doing and you never really spend time reflecting on how did you get to where you are. And I actually, enjoyed thinking about this a little bit. And so I felt like, my career has been somewhat unique for a biomedical engineer, I think, in many ways. And for good. I don't know why more people don't follow the model that I, have put together. But fine, whatever, but anyway, I think one of the most important turning points for me was kind of in that 2001, 2002 time window where, okay, I had finished my PhD, I'd been trained in kind of academic biomedical engineering. And, there was a very traditional path that was available at that time, for someone like me. And I decided, I didn't want to stay on that path. I actually wanted to basically go and do movement disorders fellowship, even though I had no MD training, right? It was not an MD. But I knew deep brain stimulation was, like the thing that I could make a contribution towards. And I was pretty sure that, deep brain stimulation was going to keep growing and it needed some scientific, guidance, if you will.
Yep.
And so what I did was then, went to Emory because that was, the place for deep brain stimulation research in the United States at the time, and still is now. But at the time, they were kind of like the only place almost in many respects. And, I went there and, Jerry Vitek was my mentor. Very well-known movement disorder neurologist that was doing intraoperative electrophysiology research.
Sure.
So I could go there, I could learn stereotactic neurosurgery, not learn how to do it, learn by watching, learn the intraoperative electrophysiology process, and learn the kind of clinical management, if you will, of deep brain stimulation patients. So I don't want to be a neurologist. I never wanted to be a neurologist, but I wanted to learn what they do and how do they use these devices and how do they interact with them and what do they think that they know about them, and what do they actually know about them? Those are usually pretty big differences.
Big difference, yeah.
So that was such an eye-opening experience for me. And it really changed my perspective on everything, because then I realized that, oh my gosh, there's so many things that, that we could do as engineers to help this field, and not necessarily about, the science projects, but more on the kind of technical development, the technology development, I guess you'd call it like, clinician education front. There were just things that were like, oh my gosh, there's knowledge out there. These people don't necessarily have direct access to it, or they even know where to find it, but maybe there's an avenue that, you could tap into there. And that was a really important turning point for me. Another, I think, so this time window from 2001 until 2003 or 4, it was, maybe one of the most productive times in my professional life. Even though it was just me, I didn't have a lab, I didn't have anything, but I had, I guess, a willingness to take a little bit of risk and, kind of get outside of my comfort zone and go and see these things, and then, learn by seeing and realizing what the opportunities were. And I think that was, while I was at Emory, I realized that, I don't want to follow the traditional academic biomedical engineering department faculty member path.
Yeah.
That I wanted to focus on being a, let's call it a medical clinical researcher, but I was just an engineer as opposed to being, a neurophysiologist or whatever, a behavioral, measurement person.
Yeah.
And I think that was, that was a really important decision. I didn't realize the significance of it at the time, but I did have to make a conscious decision, because I had, been trying to find a faculty job, and I had offers and, offers that were at traditional, BME departments and School of Engineering versus, positions that were more in like, research hospitals.
Yeah.
And I chose the research hospital route, and that was, amazingly important in shaping my, kind of future path, even though I didn't really understand the implications at the time. And then it was once I got to the Cleveland Clinic, which is the job I ended up picking, it was a really special time right then at the Cleveland Clinic. 2003, 4, 5, 6, we had, So they had consciously made the decision that they were going to try and be the new Emory.
Okay.
Hire lots of stereotactic neurosurgeons, hire lots of movement disorder neurologists, and try and just dominate that clinical market. And they really did that. They made a lot of investment. Myself on the science side, they actually ended up hiring Jerry Vitek as well, and his whole group moved up there. Jamie Henderson was there, Nick Boulos, Nitin Tandon, a whole bunch of really amazing clinicians that were really interested in neuromodulation technology. And you have to keep in perspective, at this time in the United States, this was all like very fringe. This was not mainstream medicine, at least not in the United States at that time. So, so it was a kind of a risky bet, on the part of the Cleveland Clinic, but I think it worked out well for them in general. But it was great because it put all those people together, in a common working environment. And that was hugely important for me because I got to learn so much about the clinical practice, and not just the science of it, or not just the clinical research of it, but really like the day-to-day operations of it. Where are the costs? Where are the profits? Where are the losses? There were a lot of losses. How do you maybe address it? How can you address some of those losses? Maybe with technology, or maybe with efficiency. And that's an engineer's dream, being able to see the problem and maybe come up with ideas around that to solve that problem. And I think that really changed my whole viewpoint. And I would not have seen any of that if I had been in a traditional academic BME department, right? I would have chosen.
Yeah, it's really exciting that you say that, because if I think about the worldwide experts in DBS that are not MDs that are really seeing patients, there are just a few, and you come up, Chris Butson comes up, and we come to him in a second, but it's cool to understand that this was actually a risky choice, and a good choice, I guess.
It felt like, it was an alternative choice. It just, people didn't realize that was, when I told people this is what I'm going to do, they're like, why would you take that job? That was, and many people also at that time were like, you can't have a full-time faculty career based on modeling. Forget it. No way. That is not going to work. And so I was doing two things that my environment was telling me is not a good idea. But I just didn't care. I didn't have any obligations. I didn't really care so much. I just wanted to do what I wanted to do. Yeah. These were the questions that I had passion for. And I was young and I didn't have any obligations. And so, hey, why not? Let me give this a try, so.
And the rest was history, I guess. So a lot of success on the path. And then you also mentored a lot of people yourself that became famous. I just mentioned Chris Butson. He's now a professor in Utah. Or Svetlana Miocinovich, who is now at Emory, or stayed at Emory, potentially.
No, yeah, she's at Emory now. So she was my very first graduate student. Basically the first person that I hired in the lab. Well, her and Chris at the same time. Actually one of the finalist jobs that I was comparing at the time was actually at University of Utah, which is a great engineering school and a great BME program. And it's also located in one of the most beautiful places in the whole world. The Wasatch Mountains in Utah are, just unbelievably wonderful. And at the time, I was really into snowboarding. It was a big part of my life. And it was very hard to say no to that job.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, very hard. But what I met Chris when I was out there interviewing at Utah. Chris did his PhD at Utah. And I met him while I was out there, and I tried to explain, to various people, here's where I want to go. This is what I'm thinking. And Chris really understood my, kind of idea and the vision that I had, and he could see it. And I knew that he had the technical skills, to really push that idea. And so, I guess I kind of told Utah, well, thanks but no thanks for the job, but I will take Chris Butson. You know what I mean? So he was, effectively, he and Svetlana were, my first day one employees or, trainees or whatever it is you want to call it. And, Svetlana was an MD PhD student at Case Western Reserve University, so across the street from the Cleveland Clinic, which is where my lab was actually housed. And so, those two, I have a huge debt of gratitude to both of them because they were both rock stars, amazingly skilled. And you don't really understand this when you're starting a lab, but those first 2 or 3 or 4 people that you bring in, they can make or break you. Because they have to be successful, they have to be productive, they have to be self-motivated, because you're going to get so overwhelmed, you're not going to be able to keep your head above water. You got all these new responsibilities that you didn't even know about before when you were a postdoc and you were just working on your own thing and no one ever bothered you. Yeah. Those days are over. And it's those first 2 or 3 people that have to make the lab work, or you could really be in trouble. Yeah. And so I was so lucky because it doesn't always work out that way. And so to get 2, rock stars from the very get-go, that was so lucky. That is not, you cannot expect that to happen. So that was really important. Then I think I had a different story to sell to young PhD graduates and young, graduate students that was kind of compelling, because I wasn't like a regular BME faculty lab anymore. It was really we were selling a different story, that you can be a biomedical engineer and work on questions that are, science questions. We're going to write engineering papers about this, but we're doing it in a clinical environment. And, that sounds common now. I mean, that is not abnormal, but trust me, in 2004, that was pretty abnormal. And so I think that was something that we could use to then, kind of grow the group and bring in, other great people that, maybe wouldn't have necessarily been interested in working for an assistant professor that they never heard of before, and having to live, in Cleveland, which isn't exactly a recruitment tool. I love Cleveland, by the way. I've lived in Ohio my whole life, and I'm moving next year, and I'm going to miss it very, very much.
Where are you moving?
So our lab is moving to Duke.
Great!
Next year. Yeah, it's a great fit for us, and I think it's the right step for this point in my career. But it's hard to walk away from Ohio. Very special place. And Case Western Reserve University, it's a very special place. So, Case has a terrible marketing, strategy, in my opinion. But, whether you want to believe me or not, the field of clinical neuromodulation was invented at Case. And, the whole, concept, the very first spinal cord stimulator was developed here. The industry of engineers, are supplied primarily by Case Western Reserve University. And so we have a very unique environment there, and a very special, sort of, I don't know what you want to call it, but, kind of historical knowledge base that, I couldn't have ever, had the impact that I've had in deep brain stimulation if I hadn't learned all that stuff that Case, kind of established primarily in peripheral nerve stimulation. So
let me quickly circle back, because that was really interesting that you said it wasn't common in 2002 or so that a biomedical engineer could be a PI at a hospital, and now it is. I would say in Germany it still isn't, and I really think that's a problem. So, and we should have more, a PhD PIs at hospitals, and we somehow don't seem to manage to have the funding system for that. How do you, what do you think, what changed in these years in the US? How did it
Well, I think it was just an opportunity of access. So America has so many advantages when it comes to science, mainly just because of our funding infrastructure and mechanism, right? So, having a multi-billion-dollar a year NIH budget focused on neuroengineering, neuroscience, neurotechnology research, that is such a gigantic advantage over the European system. And, you guys have other advantages that I think I'm envious of, but clearly America provides a better funding mechanism opportunity for a PhD to kind of have that kind of, opportunity.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't want to say that, back in the early 2000s that PhDs weren't PIs in clinical departments. They were.
Okay.
What was lacking was those were mostly people that are more like what you would call basic scientists, as opposed to, kind of engineering technology people.
Gotcha.
And that was, I think the break, because the engineering technology people were primarily, they had grown from traditional academia, traditional biomedical engineering departments in School of Engineering, kind of environments. And they were just all comfortable in that, right? Hey, I can build some new technology and I can write a little paper about it. And, but what they were lacking was the translation aspect of it, right? They were building technology for other PhDs. Or for other research applications, not necessarily for, that clinical step that goes from, maybe you're building technology, you're saying, well, in 10 years, this is going to be clinically relevant, but it never got to that 10 years, like this is a big problem. So where there was a gap there, and the gap was, accepting that, okay, maybe I can't work on the latest and greatest, most cutting edge, double E technology, electrical engineering, kind of like hardware technology. But if you're willing to scale back and say, okay, I got this, 4-contact system, 1 channel, how can I make something useful out of it? Yeah. It's a different kind of engineering problem. Sure. Not necessarily less challenging, maybe even more challenging in some respect, but the impact is there. The human impact opportunity is there, and that's what was important to me. And that's really, I think, the thing that you had to kind of get people over is that it wasn't just about the I guess how cool is it. How cool is the widget that you are creating as a biomedical engineer? It was more of how can you use your engineering knowledge to have a direct clinical impact? And that was I think a little bit different thought process that I was working with. So.
Great. Going in the same direction in terms of translation, I also think what's really special about your lab is that you seem to be really good at training PhDs that would go on to pursue a career in industry. For instance, Nick Malling, I know, has a position with Boston Scientific now. He was in your lab before that. And we know that not every PhD can become a professor, and not everybody wants to, surely. So I think there's a need for that. Do you have any advice in that direction? How can we best prepare PhD students or postdocs for life outside of academia?
Yeah, I think that's, so that's always been a goal for us. So, I figure, half of the people that kind of come through our group are going to go to industry and half of them are going to stay in academia. Okay. And this is actually, so I have historically, tried to focus more on postdoc training than graduate student training, for a variety of reasons. That's a whole other, kind of topic, but the first question that, kind of I ask people when they, are kind of interested in working with us is, which path are you interested in? I don't care. I'm totally fine with either one, but we are going to design a completely different training plan for your fellowship if you're going to go, more towards an industry career or more towards an academic career.
Do people always know that already?
Well, I mean, sometimes I'm the first person that asks them, which is kind of a problem. Like, for example, when I was in graduate school, I was completely convinced I was going to follow an industry path. That's, once again, I think Case, so I did my PhD at Case, and it already had this sort of like pipeline of supply to Medtronic or whatever, name your major, medical device manufacturer. So that was already kind of like a common thought as a student that, like staying in academia is only one path. In fact, most people don't do that because there aren't enough jobs for them. So I think that was, always in my mindset and part of my original training. And so, but now when, you're getting a little bit, or your lab is getting a little bit bigger, you're starting to attract attention from outside people, and they then come to you, and they might be from, a very prestigious university, but one that isn't necessarily geared towards training industrial, kind of scientists. And then, you ask them this question and they're like, oh, I guess I never thought of it, or, thought about it. And then given that I've had, a good bit of interaction with industry, I can at least give them, some moderate insight into what that career is going to be like. It's going to be different. But frankly, if your real goal is to have impact on patient care, that's the way to go. Like people think I have an impact on DBS or whatever, but, all I'm doing is just creating new ideas or writing little, silly research papers. You want to really build devices. You want to really have, like engineering impact on medicine. You've got to go to industry. That's just it, And some people, are really into that. They get excited about it. They're like, yes, I understand that concept. I want to develop the skills that are going to make me attractive to, either a startup company or to, a big, major device manufacturer. And so how do we design, my fellowship research so that that's the path?
So going back to science, likely the most influential concept that you introduced in your early work was the volume of tissue activated in, I would say, seminal work, definitely seminal work, but I think it was mainly together with Chris Butson and some others. How did you come up with the concept? And how do you think about it now, maybe?
Yeah. So it was, the whole concept of the volume of tissue activated was created completely as part of this dream that we were going to, take biophysical science and translate it into a, kind of clinical software tool. Yeah. So we knew that, it was pretty obvious to me that, okay, there were these neurologists out there. They were programming these DBS devices. It's kind of a blind search, and they might be able to benefit from some computer guided assistance, but they're not going to care about the firing of individual neurons. They just need the quick and dirty, right? And and maybe that's not a very good scientific approximation, but it's better than nothing. Kind of, that was the thinking.
Yeah.
And so, I think, Chris and I, this was really what, we worked on together was, okay, how can we, because we already had models of like the biophysics of how these neurons would, respond to stimulation. That was kind of like my PhD. Mm-hmm. And then we were thinking, okay, now how do we take that generic, kind of scientific knowledge and condense it into something that might be a rough approximation that could have some clinical value? Yeah. And, and we settled on, axons, fibers of passage, and we thought, okay, this is probably the simplest thing we could do. It's the easiest thing we can calculate. We can come up with this volume, so it's a picture that someone can look at and actually like comprehend. The volume size modulates as you change the parameters, as you change the contact, it's visually useful. And, so in retrospect, I don't know. I'm not so sure I'm all that proud of that contribution, to tell you the truth. Yes, it might eventually become, clinically useful. I think it's caused as much clinical confusion as it has utility, frankly. I think it's used inappropriately in the scientific literature. I think that it's, there's so many caveats that go into calculating the neural response to stimulation. And the more we learn, the deeper we get into understanding the real biophysics, the more I really realize the limitations of that kind of an approach.
Sure. So it was, I think the original concept was kind of validated by capsular effects, right? And then now people use it for something very different very often, right?
Exactly. And that's, so back to, kind of Chris and I's original thought process and motivation, it was, you already knew that you could get therapeutic benefit from DBS, right? As long as the electrode's in the right place, all you got to do is just turn it on. It was more of finding the limit, and the limit was primarily dictated by capsule spread. And so that's where the justification came from, the parameters that went into the original concept of the VTA, right? We use large diameter fibers that are basically straight as they're passing by the electrode, i.e. the internal capsule, right? So, that's where the 5.7 micron diameter fiber came from, right? Mm-hmm. That's a completely arbitrary decision that, but that is representative of, kind of a human motor internal capsule fiber of passage. And that's what the VTA was kind of designed to do, was to show you, okay, as I turn that knob, that amplitude knob, this is how that volume is going to get bigger. And what I'm trying to do is make it as big as I can to encompass the STN, but not spread outside of that into capsule, right? To give me where that limit is. Because, and maybe even still today, I think most clinicians, kind of approach DBS programming as more is better until I get to a side effect. Now, whether or not that's actually a good programming strategy, I would beg to differ, but that doesn't change that that's the way it's done. So,
you mentioned in a recent conversation that back then DBS modeling was not really a thing, and clinicians even didn't see the value in, maybe even trying, and most surgeons assumed their electrodes were all on spot. Probably they still do, and in the optimal target. But now, it seems like you and others have established this concept of DBS modeling for us, and now we cannot think about a world without it. So how did it feel like when you pitched these ideas to clinicians? Can you share some stories of that time?
Yeah, most of them kind of laughed at me, either blatantly to my face or under their breath when they left the room, I think. But so there were people that did get it, so Jerry Vitek, that's why I went to work with him. He didn't understand what I was doing. He didn't understand the methods. He didn't, but all he knew was, I don't know what you're talking about, but this sounds really interesting to me, and I think you got something here. It was kind of, you just need that, a little bit of validation or verification from someone that, hey, you're on the right path. I don't know what you're doing, but keep going down that road, And then when I got to the Cleveland Clinic, Jamie Henderson actually, I think, was, hugely influential on me. So he's a neurosurgeon, and he spent the time to kind of teach me about stereotactic frames, how they work, how the coordinate systems are set up, being able to actually quantify where electrodes, where you plan them to go, where they actually go. And, let's do some checks and see, oh, wait a minute, these things don't necessarily go where we thought they were going to go, that was hugely important to me. And those people had a giant impact because they were already, willing to accept that, hey, we're probably not doing this as great as we think we are. And we're probably going to need computer assistance to help. And we don't have the skills to do it ourselves. We're going to need someone else to do it. And maybe eventually Medtronic could get around to it. But frankly, their track record in that kind of technology development, is not the greatest. So, so maybe there was room for academia to kind of push that kind of, I don't want to call it product development, because it's really more like, prototype development, because that's what I feel like I do. There's a big difference between building a prototype of a software concept or a navigation concept or a programming tool than building a real product.
Sure.
Those are gigantic differences. But sometimes you got to show people, kind of a blueprint of how it might be done so that they can then move forward with some kind of a commercialization concept around that.
Okay. And since then, your models have become increasingly complex. So from the VTA, now stepping stones, I think there were many, but some were to include anisotropy, to augment the way we model conductivity in the tissue, capacitance effects on frequency. Later then, I think the inclusion of axon models that would be fit to anatomically plausible pathways. And I guess the paper by Kabi Gunala in 2017 in PLOS ONE was a big milestone, at least from outside. And recently I also saw a paper where you included axonal terminal fields into these models as well. So do you think you'll stop at some point, or will models become ever more complex?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I will always be creating more complex models. I'm sure of that.
Great.
That's my kind of approach to the problem. It doesn't mean that that's the best way to do it. It's just the way I do it. But my so I guess there's many different philosophies on, what a model is or what it should be for. And my personal strategy is that, we want to build the model to evaluate novel hypotheses and evaluate what factors actually are important or not important in, kind of predicting some kind of effect. Yeah. And the only way that you can, in my opinion, the only way that you can kind of get at that is that you have to make the model more complex to then figure out whether or not that additional complexity mattered or not.
Makes sense.
Right? So you kind of have to, keep pushing it further and further and further, especially if the questions that you're asking become more and more detailed or more and more complex. Mm-hmm. So, that's where the VTA was a very, that was like a step backwards in my personal philosophy. Right, because we already were at more complex models, and we said we've got to downplay them. We've got to scale them back so that they can become more approachable. But then when you make a model more simple, you lose things, and do those things that you lost, do they really matter or not? You could and then. Whether or not they matter actually really only depends on the question that you're asking. Sure. So if you're only asking a very generic question, then maybe a very simple and generic model is good. You want to use the most simple model you can to explain the phenomenon that you're interested in. But so Newtonian physics, worked for hundreds of years.
Yes.
Until it didn't. Right, the questions became more complicated. The questions became
like GPS or so. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like that's that's always going to continue to happen in neuroscience or in deep brain stimulation or whatever. Right, we're gonna learn something, then we're gonna ask a more complicated question. Then we're gonna learn something, we're gonna ask a more and as that process evolves, the models have to evolve as well.
The problems of assumptions, how do you deal with those? How, as you said, for example, the 5.7 diameter axon was a choice that was informed by biology, of course, but you could have likely chosen, I don't know, 5.5 or so.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing. That's where, so you and I have had this conversation, right? We have a different philosophy on, distribution of these kinds of tools to the masses. Mm-hmm. And, people probably think I'm an a-hole, because sometimes I don't want to, give, random, kind of access to some of this technology. But it's not that I don't want to give access to it. I just want to give access to people that actually understand what they're doing. Right. And so, whatever, that's a whole other conversation. We don't have to go there. But, the point is that when you use a model, you have to understand the assumptions that go into it, or you're setting yourself up for making mistakes that are really not mistakes that the model has made. They're mistakes in the questions that the user has asked, or the application that the user has attempted.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And that's what takes, years of training, is to actually be able to call bullshit on assumptions and make decisions about where assumptions are valid and where they're not, and that's a very hard thing. And it's hard. That's this constant struggle that, I feel like I personally have with trying to translate scientific biophysics into clinical practice. It's a hard balance, and there's nothing in the world I want more than for DBS clinicians to use knowledge and information and scientific data that has come from our research, right? That's the most gratifying thing that can possibly happen to a PhD research scientist. But, you also don't want them to use that knowledge and information inappropriately and then do stupid things with it.
Sure.
And I can, now at this point in my career, I can tell people, like, you're stupid. And they're not going to shun me. And some people might actually respect that. But, at earlier points in my career, right, it's not as if I could just walk up to, the Andres Lozanos of the world and say, oh my God, you're doing this completely wrong. That is not a good political strategy. So, yeah. Of course.
And that must be frustrating because, as mentioned before, you are somewhat in a community that 99% are MDs, right? And that have no clue about these things, but think they have a clue of these things. So I can only imagine that at conferences or in conversations, including with me, of course, it can feel quite frustrating. Yeah.
Well, I think that's what is truly special about more so in the DBS neurosurgery community than I find in the DBS neurology community. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are many great people in the DBS neurology community. But in general, I find that the DBS neurosurgery community is a little bit more willing to accept where their knowledge limitations are. And maybe it's because they don't actually deal with the programming as much, and the neurology side does. And they're like, listen, I know what I'm doing. Get out of my way, Whereas the neurosurgery, I think over the years, they've slowly acknowledged and realized that, maybe our targeting isn't as good as we thought it was. Maybe it's not as accurate as we thought it was. And maybe there are things that, we could improve. And there's kind of this constant evolution. The technology gets better. The stereotactic targeting systems get better. The planning software gets better. And I think that's why more recently in my career, I've more gravitated towards the neurosurgery side than I have the neurology side. I just find them to be slightly more, willing to accept that there are limitations, then we need to fix them, kind of thing. So
I agree, and I would also say another, like I'm hurting my own field now, but I would say that neurosurgeons, on average at least, are also much more knowledgeable about anatomy, and since they are really putting the electrodes in, they kind of care more. Everything they do is irreversible, and what neurologists do is not. They can just turn it off again. And I've talked about this also with other colleagues and with Marwan Haris here in this podcast as well. And I think, maybe neurosurgeons do care more, at least on average, I could imagine. Yeah. So,
well, I think that their success is more binary. It's either I got the electrode in the right place or I didn't, and it can be quantified. It can be observed. It can be, documented. And, the neurology side is so much more of an art. And there's something important about being, having that artistic skill of being able to manage. It's not just turning on the stimulator and selecting the contact. It's also balancing the medications. It's, trying to figure out what it is that this patient really needs, in terms of their symptom control, and not just, so I like, the clean black and white of the neurosurgery side. You either got it where it was supposed to go or you didn't, that's much more appealing from an engineering perspective. And, I don't know, I don't want to get too conspiracy theory cynical about it, but frankly, that's where the money is. I have a general philosophy when developing technology or thinking about kind of the clinical opportunity for impact. The strategy is start with the money and work backwards, because that's where you have an opportunity to actually develop something that might be kind of translatable. The neurosurgeon is, in many respects, the customer of the device companies, and so it's another kind of reason why I think I have gravitated more towards the neurosurgery side of the technology development more recently.
Yeah, a newer development which has been a true milestone for our field was the holographic tract atlas that you published in Neuron, spearheaded by Mikkel Pettersen. Could you tell us a bit about this project? I know some of the most knowledgeable anatomists of especially basal ganglia research were involved, and you used pretty cool technology again to create this atlas. Yeah,
that was without a doubt the most fun science project I've ever worked on. I mean, so must have been about like 2015. I saw the the HoloLens, the Microsoft HoloLens was the platform technology that we kind of, built this around. That was a mind-blowing experience for me. There are a few times in my career where I feel like I have had an epiphany, and that was one of them, so this device, it's a head-mounted display that's intended to give you a visual perception or a visual simulation that looks like a hologram. It's not a real hologram, but your retina interprets it as such. And I put this on. At the time, this was not a public technology. This was a unique research collaboration between Microsoft and Case Western Reserve University, and one of my best friends at work was the guy who was leading this collaboration. He's a MR physicist, Mark Griswold is his name, and so we had worked together for many years, and we already knew each other. And he called me. He said, "I can't really tell you a whole lot about this, but I got this thing, and you got to see it, man." And go in there, sign a bunch of confidentiality papers, and put this on. And at the time, they didn't really have much, in terms of content for this device. And so it was this, it was the solar system. The sun was in the middle, and the planets were rotating around, and it was cool, But I was like, I don't really care about astronomy. That's not my thing. But after having the headset on for 15 seconds, I was like, I know exactly what we're doing with this in neurosurgery. It was so obvious to me. It was so clear exactly what it was going to be, how it was going to look, what we were going to do with it. But I knew that, we still had a long way to go, right? You can't just build a neurosurgical navigation, kind of planning visualization system, in a day. It's going to take time. And we also needed to get some funding to pay for this. It wasn't like I was just going to be able to, make money magically appear. So I thought that the real opportunity was, the Human Connectome project at that time was roaring hot, right? And people were using tractography for everything, right? This is 2015, 16, 17 kind of time window. And I was like, man, I don't think these streamlines look anything like the real pathways look like. I think this is all bullshit. But, I was like, you know what, this tool, that was kind of another, I think good idea. I was like, this tool is the way that we could bring, that anatomy knowledge into a space where the real anatomist could, kind of capitalize on, like, what do these pathways really look like? And so that was the grant, like the next day, like I went and started writing this grant. Like the next day after I had put the HoloLens on for the first time, I was like, okay, this is how we're going to pay for this. We're going to get NIH to pay for bringing these anatomists together. We, populate all this data into the holographic environment, and we basically let them, draw these pathways in, modern human, kind of high quality brain atlas space.
Yeah.
And it worked pretty well. I mean, it was pretty fun. Like, I mean, I'm sure Mikkel would say the same thing. I mean, it was a crazy fun thing. It was like, well, these anatomists, so we had gotten Suzanne Haber, Peter Strick, Johan Smith, and Martin Perrant all together. Okay, these people had never worked together before in their whole life.
Yeah, that alone is amazing, I think.
Right?
Yeah.
And frankly, some of them really don't like each other. Like, there's, actual personal animosity. And yet, I don't know, you'd have to ask them, but they might say that I kind of tricked them into this, because I was like, I call them up or email them and say, I can't really tell you a whole lot about this, because at that time, even when I submitted the grant or when I'm writing the grant, the device, the original HoloLens still wasn't even publicly out there. So I can't even tell them about it, right? Because I already signed these confidentiality agreements. So I can't even tell them. I'm just like, listen, I got this thing. And what we're going to do is use holograms to draw axonal pathways. And trust me, I know you're not going to, you don't understand what I'm saying, but just trust me on this one, and, they agreed, and so finally, we get the money, we, kind of pull the group together, we find times that we can all, kind of come to Cleveland together and do these group interactive environments. And
how long did they take time for that? Was it multiple days or?
Yeah, we'd do a 2-day thing. So they'd fly in, try and get there in the afternoon. Maybe we'd do a little bit, stay for dinner. We'd kind of discuss the plan over dinner. Then the next morning, we'd kind of get back to work. And we, kind of did that, kind of cycle twice. And which, sounds kind of like, wow, that's not really very much time. But really, Mikkel did tons of background work to kind of get it all set up. And so it was really more about, kind of interactive discussion. And then Mikkel would, kind of add, edit, delete, modify based on the discussions. And we could do interactive, kind of adjustments. And we did some of that too. But what we found was it was really more about the conversation. The visualization facilitated the conversation, and each one of those anatomists had really a different kind of expertise, right? So Johan Smith's kind of more about the synaptic connectivity. Martin Perrant's more about the single axon trajectory. Suzanne and Peter, their spectrum of skill is wider because they've been in the game for so long, and they're really more about the big picture connectivity matrix. And it was just, I don't know. I mean, like I said, it was the most enjoyable scientific experience, I think that I've ever been a part of, because, you just had the opportunity to blend that knowledge in a way that, I just don't think could be done in any other mechanism or any other medium. So anyway, yeah, that was a great, paper, and I've been working for years now on getting the HoloDBS paper put together.
Well, one more thing about the tracts that I wanted to mention. I think what's so cool about it is that, if you go back to 1900, that's where anatomists drew structures. And these are still among the best representations we have. They are then I sometimes feel then MRI came and, people lost all that. And when I really want to know, the exact course of the ansa lenticularis or something, I often pull up these very old textbooks that are hand drawn by, by people that you don't know anymore about. And I think you transformed that into a 3D experience, right? So it should be done more. It's really amazing that, that basically went back to drawing. I mean, I know you used histology in that atlas and everything, so it wasn't made up out of thin air, but that's still probably one of the best ways to depict these structures. But now you do it in 3D, so it's really cool.
Exactly. That's what, I mean, frankly, I thought that the scientific reception of this article would be far greater than it has been. And I think that the lack of interest in reality really just goes back to the massive overinvestment that both America and Europe have made in, tractography and connectomic research, which is, in my opinion, is terribly misguided and frankly not very representative of actual anatomy. And, but when you have billions upon billions of dollars and thousands of researchers whose careers are, completely based on this one form of connectomic definition, man, that is a gigantic super tanker that is going to be very hard to turn.
I even think a lot of people see your article and think it's tractography, right? And think it's DTI.
Oh, exactly. People tell me that all the time. They're like, oh, so how did you make the tractography go that way? Because tractography won't make those pathways. I mean,
it won't. I tried. Yeah, it's true.
Mikkel and I have a paper that we're working on, still, trying to kind of compare it against various tractography methods. And like none of them can even, do very well. And it's
interesting because I met Mikkel before he joined your lab, still here in Europe, and he was a tractography guy, right? So
yes,
must have been an experience for him as well.
Yeah. And man, I wish that guy still worked in the lab. I mean, he's back in Denmark now, and I think he's very happy, and and good for him. But man, we could have done 10 more papers like that I think would have been amazingly impactful. And, and I still hope to do them, like you said, we can do this, we can take this platform and we can apply it in other, networks, other parts of the brain. And I think it will be equally useful. The motor system and the basal ganglia is, it was a good one to start with because there's so much background data to help guide the development. Much of the problem with, some of the newer areas that we would like to put deep brain stimulation electrodes into is that we actually don't have very good circuitry maps. And we don't really know much about the single neuron anatomy or the, axonal connectivity. And that, is kind of a, the old school anatomist is actually more relevant now than I think they were, 20 years ago, 50 years ago.
I agree. Yeah. So that leads me to the next question. You recently mentioned that DBS models for movement disorders are fundamentally different than for neuropsych. For example, major depression, OCD in the internal capsule, or CG25. And I think that is because of that, right? Because we have much more ground knowledge about the pathways in the basal ganglia area, STN, GPI area.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I feel like there are completely different levels of questions that, we are scientifically interested in DBS for movement disorders compared to DBS for neuropsych. And, we just have so much more knowledge about, or maybe not just knowledge, we just have more advanced hypotheses about what we're stimulating for the treatment of Parkinson's disease compared to what we are stimulating for the treatment of depression or obsessive compulsive disorder or epilepsy for that matter. There are just so many things about the, kind of prefrontal territories of the brain and the axonal connectivity of those areas that are just completely unknown, in my opinion.
So we're asking much simpler questions, right? It's more about which rough thing are we stimulating, whereas in STN-DBS we know it works, we roughly know the sweet spot, and yeah, it's more about the details. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's how, my research is kind of geared. Over the last decade or so, we've spent about half of the time working on DBS for neuropsych and half of the time working on DBS for Parkinson's. But completely different kinds of models and in my opinion, completely different kinds of models and completely different kinds of questions that we're really working on for that. So
I interrupted you before. I think you were elaborating on the holographic DBS that you're...
Yeah. So that, that's my real goal was not to build the anatomy program. That was just a stepping stone to get to, building the, let's call it neurosurgical planning and, visualization tool. And so I don't know. I've struggled with how to construct that paper and what to include and frankly, like what kind of journal to target. And so, instead of just getting it done, I've spent years just delaying it. And that's actually one of my, personal failures, I think, over this pandemic is that I haven't just gotten it done. But anyway, I am very excited to kind of get that paper out, but instead of worrying about the paper, most of my last 2 or 3 years has actually been just throwing that tool out into the field and showing it to people and beta testing it with, the neurosurgical community. And so, while that probably hasn't helped my, scientific, impact factor or whatever, I think we learned so much by taking that technology and showing it to people and getting their feedback and talking with them about it. And then, actually now we're, actively doing prospective, kind of neurosurgical planning studies with it. And, like I said, I haven't written the papers about this, but frankly, I don't even care anymore because, this is it. For 20 years, I've been working on trying to get somewhere.
Wow.
And now I feel like we're doing it. We're finally doing it, and maybe I'm a little too, you always get wrapped up in your own hype and your own, kind of dreams. But, I guess that's kind of it. I kind of have not been working on those papers because I'm actually doing the thing I wanted to do all along.
Amazing.
And that's, to me, more important.
So I think in the think tank, DBS think tank, Samir Sheth showed some videos, and he also said this is surely the future of how we do these. And I think what you use it for, I don't know if we can tell that, we can cut it out later if that's...
oh, no.
Okay. So I think what you're doing is really also the main difference may be that you're currently using it with a lot of leads. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. That's the killer app for this particular technology is not just regular old, subthalamic DBS targeting. That, that's a very well-defined art that, doesn't really need much in the way of groundbreaking visualization. Yeah. The killer app, and this is what, I learned this by testing it with Samir and with Nader and with, people from all over the world. And it's really hard to think about the interplay between 10 different leads. The 3D trajectories, their places relative to all the different anatomical structures. And so right now, yes, those are, SEEG cases for epilepsy or stereo EEG, or these, new, some may say, kind of out there investigational clinical trials in DBS for neuropsych, the UCSF group, the Baylor and UCLA group, and some others that are, kind of are doing this, let's call it, I think Samir calls it, stereo EEG informed DBS. So, can you maybe, you're still going to put the DBS leads in the same places we always did, but maybe you learn something more about how the circuitry actually, is impacted by the DBS, and that might then help you figure out, like different ideas of how we stimulate through these DBS leads. And at first I was kind of like, well, this sounds a little out there to me. But now I actually have become, quite enamored with this concept, and I do believe that it is going to bear quite a bit of really amazingly important scientific fruit.
Sure.
And I feel like, our holographic, kind of planning and visualization actually, is playing quite an important role in helping to define where we're putting these leads and what the connectivity matrices, really are between these different electrode locations and relative to the anatomy. And, I don't know, it's hard to put in words because, it's like, I don't know, how do you quantify, the fact that we move the electrodes by, 10 millimeters, because we were using this plan or this, this visualization platform.
I mean, it looks impressive. I think people that see the videos would agree. I mean, maybe one question. So I completely see the value. I haven't used it at all, of course, but I completely see the value in more macroscopic way of, how the leads interact. Do they even cross each other or come too close or something? And maybe then more focusing on the contacts themselves, is that precise enough? I mean, is the looking at it and moving it precise enough, or would you still fine-tune that in the normal computer with a mouse or so?
Yeah, so the way we're doing it right now anyway is we've got giant kind of pathway representations throughout the entire brain. So we're using the Ye et al. Connectome atlas for kind of the big global pathways, and then we use the Peterson pathways for some of the more basal ganglia structures. All those streamlines, we're talking about, I don't know, tens of thousands of streamlines get warped into patient space, and then those streamlines then are available for kind of overlap analyses with the we'll call them VTAs, but actually we just kind of call them contact volumes.
Yeah.
Because we're also using the recording contact volume, right? Because it's the interaction between the area where you're stimulating and the area where you're recording.
Sure.
And you're trying to see, whether or not those contacts are actually, going to get to interaction with the stimulation, so that you are going to record, from areas that, presumably should have a high degree of connectivity and others that maybe shouldn't. And the beauty of the stereo EEG trajectories is that, well, you're sampling across a lot of things along that general space, right? 10, maybe 15 contacts. And so the connectivity, or the, whatever you want to call it, the tractography results are going to tell you, well, 3 of these contacts should have very high connectivity and 7 of them should have almost none, right? And now it's the first time that we can actually electrophysiologically validate or verify whether or not those predictions are actually legit or not.
And that would be normal DBS leads in Parkinson's and STN, but then you have additional SEEG electrodes, and then you can maybe investigate that scientifically, right?
Yeah, exactly. We're stimulating a bunch of things that we know we're stimulating. Yeah. We're also stimulating a bunch of things that we don't know that we're stimulating. And this is a way to kind of to figure out what are all those things that, that we were stimulating that we didn't even know were getting, modulated. Or maybe they're indirectly modulated, but now we know that they are, somehow connected into this really complex network system. And it's just very hard to think about a different strategy in which you will acquire that kind of knowledge and data. And so these patients, I struggle with actually the risk that they are undertaking for nothing more than just scientific data collection. Mm-hmm. It's not as if these tools are really ready to, guide anything from a clinical perspective.
Yeah.
but eventually they will, right? I mean, it's a chicken and egg problem. You gotta do it to figure out where the stuff is and where the connectivity is and where the, kind of stimulation-based, effects are. Yeah. So then you can actually maybe eventually turn it on its head and use that kind of knowledge and information to customize the stimulation to the patient. And, I do believe that eventually we will get there. We're not there yet, though.
So beyond creating academic software, such as the one we were just talking about, and before that, I guess the first one was Cicerone, and Svetlana was the first author on that, if I'm not mistaken. Then I think you had Stim Explorer and Stim Vision, currently the main software. Is that the same software you use for the holographic? Or is
basically.
Basically.
Yeah, so the whole, we call it HoloDBS or Holo SEEG.
Yeah.
Like, it's just Stim Vision running on Microsoft HoloLens.
Okay.
Yeah.
So beyond that, your center has also worked with industry partners to commercialize software such as the Boston Scientific Guide System or its newer version, Guide XT. And I think that is, again, something very unique in the field that not many labs have done successfully. So I have to ask these questions to pick your brain. What were the challenges and also the perks of working with industry? Were there also, downsides? I guess there were probably, but, what did you learn? Which tips would you give fellow academics if they would be interested in doing something like that?
Yeah. I mean, so for me, it's a no-brainer. Like, if your goal is to impact, clinical medicine, this is the only mechanism. You're not going to do that with your silly little research papers, and you can help people understand things with research papers. You can't actually, create products with them. And the only person that's going to create products, are these industry partners. And so I wouldn't change anything, about what I have gone through or learned. Well, there's many things actually I would change financially about how I was handled or things that, decisions I made. But in terms of just the fundamentals of working with industry, absolutely, I wouldn't change anything about my current strategy or approach to that. And so to me, there's almost all benefits and really, I can't think of too many negatives aside from maybe people think that, my work is corrupted in some way by that. But, well, it's probably not clear to the outside world. Like, my lab takes zero funding from industry. We have, all of our money comes from NIH and we do not do sponsored contracts or whatever. And so you try and minimize the perception of conflict of interest, as much as you can. But, in my opinion, everyone has a conflict of interest. I mean, a basic scientist has a conflict of interest that their results look good so they can publish it in Nature or whatever it is that they want to do. So
there's this saying that in science, overfitting can get you a Nature paper, and in industry, overfitting can get you lose your job. So, and I think that there is something to that, right? I guess, so that makes sense. But I think specifically what you said, the things how you have been handled, or so. I think that is part of the fear that some people might have. That. I think one preconception would be, industry will just abuse me, and in the end they take my stuff and I get nothing or whatever. I think that for the people without any experience in that would be the fears, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's it's real. Like, so, the company that, was, the original startup that, became Guide XT or whatever, like one of my good friends said, well, that experience was not the best for me. But when, one of my good friends characterized it as, well, like, you just had to pay really expensive tuition to learn a bunch of really important lessons, and so nowadays, once again, you got to go back to 2004 when that company was formed, it wasn't common. Like, it wasn't normal to be creating spin-off companies, as an academic. And so, I didn't know what I was doing. I was, 20 something years old. Well, my gosh, of course I don't know things. And, and sometimes, you end up in relationships that you don't want to be with, but you also have a goal in mind. The goal is what you got to, if your real goal is to get something out there into the real world and have real clinicians using it, then you have to kind of prioritize that, okay, that's the real goal, not something else, not something academic. And you then, deal with the situation and make decisions that you have to make to see that happen. And that's hard when, people might look at that and say, well, that's not the academic way. And you should stay pure, or you should stay, uncorrupted or whatever. But frankly, it was that corruption, if you want to call it that, that led to me understanding more and led to realizing where the opportunities actually are for impact, and where the opportunities are not. Maybe that's even more important, right? You realize that, oh my God, I could spend a lot of time working on developing this thing, and frankly, industry is going to have zero interest in it. Mm-hmm. No interest whatsoever, even though my academic colleagues are saying that this is exactly what we have to work on.
Okay.
Right? So I think that, nowadays I have great relationships with industry, and I'm very happy with them, and I don't feel like people, quote unquote, take advantage of me or whatever. So I don't want that perception to maybe come across out of our last 10 minutes of conversation. That's definitely not true now. But that's because I'm in a different state of respect, and maybe some people might even say fear, right?
Sure.
And so, no one's going to screw with me anymore. But that's because we keep producing results and we keep asking questions that are relevant to industry. And so you always got to kind of stay ahead of the game too, if you want to play in that game. And it's not for everyone. It's not for all, I certainly don't advocate that, all academic neuroengineers or whatever should be doing this game plan. Yeah. It's not right for everyone. But, I think that it's important to do if, we want to see these technologies actually out there in the real world.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think, and DBS might even be a special case for that, right? Where we have to somehow develop things with industry together. Jens Volkmann always says that, for example, devices, we only get better devices that are more capable of, recording or something like that if we, collaborate with industry, for example, to use them and then, or to ask them the right questions to develop them and so on. So, maybe that isn't the same in every field, but DBS is so much at the interface between medicine and technology that probably it has to be done. So, yeah, makes complete sense to me.
Yeah, I think so. And it's good for, it's very hard for a startup company to, even though they might have a lot cooler technology than Medtronic or Boston Scientific can provide to the masses, it's very hard for a startup company to have the capital and to have the resources and to have the hospital connections and all these things that have to go into sort of providing the environment for testing, novel neuromodulation platforms and novel neuromodulation technologies, whether they be hardware, software, whatever. Yeah. So, you're not going to be able to have the most cutting edge academic prototype in a clinical environment. It's just not those two things just don't go together for safety reasons, if nothing else, but also for capital reasons and for, whatever you want to call it, infrastructure reasons. Yeah. And so, I used to think that, why isn't Medtronic doing more? And why isn't, Abbott doing more? like, my gosh, like there's so much need. There's so much more, that these devices should be able to do. Why aren't they doing more? And maybe partly with age and partly with perspective, you come to realize that, there are really good reasons why they're not doing more. And maybe they're not obvious to the academic community, but there are really good reasons why. So, yeah.
And so you collaborated with the big fish, but you also founded spin-offs, and that were sometimes, I guess, then bought. So how many spin-offs did you found, if you still remember? And so founding a startup sounds like a lot of fun. Is it that way, or is it, since you do it in parallel to academia, it's probably not like that you hang out in the startup room all the time and, talk with, how can we picture that?
Yeah. So I have, been a key co-founder in 3 different companies. And then I do a lot of consulting, for other companies, right? And so I have, very small roles in a bunch of companies, but then really only had this kind of key role in 3. Okay. So the first one was very complicated company. It was really, it was called Intellect Medical. It was an amalgamation of many, many, many different pieces of IP from many different investigators. And it was put together, with the idea of becoming like the next Medtronic. And it was going to be, like a device company. That's what it was designed to be, not a software company. And it was only after, several years of evolution that it became a software company in the end. And so that was a very unique situation. I don't think anyone would be dumb enough to try and do a startup company like that again. Or if they did, I would personally call them and tell them, do not do this. So it was the hubris of, the Cleveland Clinic thinking that, they knew a lot more than they really did. And, just personalities and people that, were, I think, very well intentioned and had a vision that was really exceptional. But the realities didn't actually line up with the vision in many ways. So the next company that I co-founded was a much more focused and small neurosurgical targeting company called Surgical Information Sciences. This was a collaboration with Noam Harel and Guillermo Sapiro, and it was really completely a follow-on to Intellect Medical. The whole point was I knew exactly what the problems were, with the whole concept of guide and the programming software ideas, and I knew that the real problem was that, well, one, the electrodes aren't going where they're supposed to go from the surgeons, and then once the electrodes are in, we didn't have good enough anatomical descriptions to help, actually make the models relevant. So you had to fix those 2 things, and actually you could fix that, with improved techniques for anatomical imaging. And that company was really more of an image processing company than it was anything else, and still is today. It actually, it's still going on. They have FDA approval. They're moving forward, but, I don't know. I learned a lot through that company. Once again, a bunch of things that, mistakes that I wish, we hadn't made. But they were, and, you learn from them, and hopefully you don't make that mistake again. The third company is called Hologram Consultants, and it is, effectively the offshoot of, our holographic visualization stuff. But it's not a prospective surgical targeting company. In fact, it's an education company.
Okay.
So the big device manufacturers, people don't, I think, understand this as much, but they spend more money on marketing and clinician training than they do on technology development.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. So, and to me, that's one of the things about the, kind of HoloLens experience that is, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what you know. when you see things in that environment, you learn something different every time. Even me, I mean, I use the device, every day almost. And every time I'm like, oh, I learned something new. And it is just one of the greatest teaching environments that, I've ever been in. And so that's the play, is that this is a teaching tool.
You have specific rooms for that, or can you do it anywhere with the lens?
No. So the really cool thing about HoloLens 2, which was released in last year, is that it's got these really amazing remote networking capabilities. So all throughout the pandemic, actually, we've been doing this stuff. So we FedEx lenses to people's houses, and then we all get in, like this, common virtual environment and can do the surgical plans, right? So that's how we've been doing the surgical plans for, like Samir's project or whatever. Is Nader Paradian's in LA, Samir is in Houston, myself and Angela are in Cleveland, and we're all in a common holographic scene. I'm in my living room, he's in his living room, she's in her living room, and, but we all are seeing the exact same hologram in a co-registered space. Oh. And we see each other as like my hand shows up, as an avatar hand, and my head shows up as an avatar head, so where the other person is. And then the device has 3D audio. So when you're standing over there and talking, I hear you as you're on my left. And, and you can point, and I see where you're pointing, and I can point, and you see where I'm pointing. Wow. And so it's amazingly transformative, in my opinion. And it's a great way to collaborate now without traveling, right? We were not, like the very first time we did this, everyone, like with the anatomists or the very first surgical planning things we did with this, like everyone flew to Cleveland. Yeah. And we did it all in Cleveland because that's where the thing was set up. And the pandemic actually forced us to rethink, like that was great because in-person communication is always better, right? I mean, I don't care what your situation is. Yeah. But if you can't travel and you can't do in person, then you got to have a different method. And this forced us to develop that platform, for that, kind of new reality.
Really cool.
And frankly, I think it's better now.
I can see so many applications also just for remote programming, of course, later, and then, or for, if a surgeon wants expert advice, someone in China wants expert advice from the US or so too.
Absolutely. And it can be patient specific or it can be general, right? That's what I'm saying. There's a training environment there that is, I think will be amazingly helpful to facilitating kind of the dissemination of new ideas of how do you do surgical planning, or new ideas about how do you do clinical programming using these different kinds of data sets. And, you can do it with a 2D computer screen. It's not that it can't be done. It's just this is a much more immersive and engrossing kind of experience that I think helps reinforce the concepts.
Makes sense. I've stolen already so much of your time. Maybe a few rapid fire questions to wrap up. Would you be willing to share a moment or story of true success with us? A eureka moment. You mentioned one before, but what was where you saw something and said, "This is amazing"? I think it was when you put the HoloLens on, but maybe something else. Yeah. I think that is probably my best example. And I think the first time that we did the surgical plan with Nader and Samir in Cleveland, those were pretty special moments, I'd say, in my scientific career. Like they were like, yeah, you had a vision, you build a tool, you kind of throw it out there, and then you get the response that you dreamt of. That's pretty much as good as it gets in science, I think. Amazing. How about the opposite? How about failures? Or did you ever think this was a complete waste of my time? Or, this didn't go well?
Yeah, like daily. So yeah.
Yes, that's normal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of part of science is, you got to be okay with getting, punched in the face on a regular basis and, and just shrugging it off. And, I think, maybe one of the low points for me was, I don't know, I'd say maybe in the 2012, 2013 time window, we had kind of gotten to the point where, like, we've got these software tools, they're out there, being developed commercially, we're using them, and you start asking harder questions with them, feeding in, kind of, retrospective patient data and they're just not doing very well. They're like, what we've seen in the literature recently, really poor predictive qualities. And that is coming, in my opinion, from, low quality imaging, coming from, maybe, not such great clinical score data, or just, like retrospective data, just in general. It's problematic. And, man, yeah, it was, I remember thinking, oh my God, like, this is not going to work. And my whole career is, a joke. And, at the same time, though, we had the new work in the neuropsych arena where the models, it didn't matter that the models were weak.
Yeah.
They were still able to make relevant predictions that were clinically impactful, right? And we were doing prospective surgical targeting and making a big difference. And so that's when, sometimes it's those low points that you then come to like realize, oh, wait a minute, like DBS for neuropsych modeling is totally different than DBS for movement disorders modeling.
That makes a lot of sense.
The questions are different. The application is different. The need is different.
Yeah.
And the opportunity then, to then, kind of say to myself, all right, like whatever it is that we were doing in 2010 for movement disorders, it's not good enough. Like we've got to really, improve our anatomical accuracy. We've got to really improve our electrical, realism. And maybe those will be the key to making it work better in those applications where, it's just a much higher bar that you have to cross because it's so much more of a mature, DBS, kind of technology.
Yeah, I guess that mature really puts it. 80% are top or well responders. Then you have Parkinsonian symptoms that fluctuate a lot and so on. The scores are messy. So you're totally right. I guess in neuropsych, there is more variability in targeting still and so on. So easier questions, as we said before. Yeah,
and it's just, they're new, research, clinical trials, so, it's very different than trying to apply a technology in a 30-year-old established clinical workflow that has a level of expectation that is just much, much, much higher,
Yeah. Which things should the younger generation of DBS researchers know? So which things should also not be forgotten? As younger people often just haven't lived through the years.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have. We've talked about a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
I hope that, people, get something useful out of this because I think that there's lots of up and downs, and you gotta, so I guess here's my, my advice to young investigators is, first, don't be afraid to do something, different with your career path than what everyone else around you is doing. If you truly believe in your idea and you truly believe in your direction, then, trust your gut. So I guess that's kind of, lesson number one. Number two is you're going to get kicked in the face so many times. And that is science. That's why it works, is because, people call out bullshit and make you address your assumptions and make you address your limitations. And you have to be, able to respond, with, okay, I went and I fixed this and it is better now. Or no, I went and fixed this and your stupid suggestion was total crap, but you got to be able to respond with data, not with, I don't know. Anyway,
sure.
So I'd say those are the two things that, you have to just have that grit to just keep going, because, there are very few times of enjoyment in this field, in my opinion. And there's a lot of negativity, but that negativity is actually what makes science work.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Makes sense. It's a bit pessimistic, but I guess you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a glass half empty kind of guy. So, I guess, yeah.
Cameron, anything else you would like to say that we didn't cover before I let you off?
No, I think, another important, this was another note I would say to someone building a lab is, number one is, those first couple people, man, they're so important. And then second is that, a good lab should have people coming and going all the time. That's how the new ideas kind of get there. New people come in, they got new, kind of techniques, new methods, whatever it might be. But you want them to leave. That's the whole point is, you got to get rid of them after 2 or 3 years and hope that they go on and, do other cool things. But in parallel with that, it's really important, I think, or it has been for me, to have 2 or 3 people that are long-term employees. And so for me, that's always been Angela Naker and Annika Frankenmull. Now her last name's now Gilbert. But, those 2 people, whatever, I'm only in the old days when we actually went to the office, I'm only in the office 2, maybe 3 days a week. And the rest of the time, you're traveling, you're at conferences, you're doing other stuff that you have to do as a faculty member. But those are the people that are there every day, right? They provide the continuity, they provide the structure, and, and they, provide the soul, if you will, of the lab. And sometimes those people kind of get lost and forgotten because they're not, first authors on the big papers and things like that. But yeah, that has been key, I think, to our laboratory function. And I think that's a really important thing to put into your plan as you're, kind of developing your scientific laboratory.
That's great advice. Thanks a lot. All right. Thank you so much for your time. I learned a lot, so that I think other people will enjoy it to listen to this. So thank you so much for that.
Good. I hope so. It was, more fun than I anticipated. And, I enjoyed telling some of these stories that I hadn't thought about for a long, long time. So thank you.